He was born with royal blood, but lived as if cursed. You may not remember his name, but heaven never forgot it. Mephibosheth, a name buried under shame, brokenness, and the long shadows of a fallen house. He was the grandson of King Saul, but his crown was never placed. Instead, his feet were crushed and his future silenced. When kingdoms collapse, names like his get lost in the ruins. But behind this forgotten man lies a story not of defeat, but of divine promise. His journey was not just about suffering, it was about a covenant deeper than blood, stronger than shame, a covenant that reached across years and across scars. Because Mephibosheth didn't seek the king sought him. And in that sacred search, we uncover a truth that God doesn't forget his promises even when we've forgotten our worth. He was born into a royal bloodline, destined for thrones and victories. As the son of Jonathan and the grandson of King Saul, Mephibosheth carried a name tied to power and prestige. In another world, he might have grown up with servants at his call and kingdoms in his grasp, but destiny would not be kind to him. The crown he inherited came soaked in betrayal, jealousy, and war. Saul, the first king of Israel, was chosen by God but fell by his own hand. His reign, once full of promise, ended in pride, rebellion, and divine silence. And Jonathan, Saul's son, was caught between loyalty to his father and a deep covenant friendship with David, the one anointed to replace him. Mephibosheth was born into this conflict, a child of both royal favor and inevitable collapse. He never asked for the war, but it shaped his story. The palace walls that once held laughter became silent halls of suspicion and grief. Saul's obsession with killing David turned the kingdom into a battlefield. And Jonathan, though faithful, could not stop what was coming. Mephibosheth's birthright was stained by a father's loyalty and a grandfather's fall. When the news of Saul and Jonathan's death reached the palace, fear swept through like a plague. The royal household, now exposed and vulnerable, scrambled to flee. Mephibosheth was just 5 years old, too young to understand, too fragile to resist. In a single day, he lost his father, his grandfather, his future, and the stability of everything he knew. And then came the moment that would define the rest of his life. In the chaos, his nurse tried to escape with him, but she fell, and he fell with her. Not spiritually, not politically, but physically. The Bible says he became lame in both feet. One fall, and the prince could no longer walk. One fall, and the legacy of kingship turned into the burden of brokenness. He didn't fall because he was sinful. He didn't fall because of disobedience. He fell because someone else stumbled. And in that fall, his entire destiny seemed to fracture. That is how trauma works. It arrives without permission and changes everything. Mephibosheth's story began not with a mistake, but with a misstep. And yet, God had already written redemption into his name. Because this isn't just history, this is prophecy. Mephibosheth's life echoes the human condition. We were created in royalty in the image of God, but sin broke the world, and we fell, not always by our own doing, but still wounded by it. And just like him, many of us find ourselves crippled in a world that no longer sees our value. But here is the beginning of the miracle, though he was born into a broken legacy. Mephibosheth was also born into a covenant he didn't make, but that would one day find him. Because long before the fall, there was a vow, a sacred promise made between his father Jonathan and the future King David. A vow that would reach across time, across shame, and across broken bones to find him, exactly when he least expected it. It happened in a moment, a rush, a scream. The nurse carrying Mephibosheth ran through stone corridors with terror in her heart. News had reached the palace. Saul and Jonathan were dead. The dynasty had collapsed, and with that collapse came the fear of vengeance. Who would survive? Who would be hunted in her panic to protect the boy? She lost her grip, and everything changed. The fall was physical, but its consequences were spiritual, emotional, and generational. His tiny body struck the stone, bones twisted, nerves were crushed. And just like that, the feet that were meant to walk in courts of kings could no longer move. A child who had done no wrong now bore the marks of a broken world. The prince became a prisoner of pain, of shame, of memory. We often think of wounds as punishment for sin, but Mephibosheth's injury came through no fault of his own. He didn't rebel. He didn't run. He simply fell because someone dropped him. And that's what makes this part of his story so powerful. How many of us are walking through life with wounds caused by someone else's fear, someone else's failure. His name, Mephibosheth, means from the mouth of shame, and that shame clung to him like a shadow, not just because of his crippled feet, but because of who he was, a descendant of Saul, a reminder of the past many wanted to erase. In a world that prized strength, he became invisible. In a nation that feared Saul's legacy, he became unwanted. The fall didn't just break his body, it exiled him. He was hidden away, far from Jerusalem, far from the palace, far from the table that once belonged to his bloodline. Every step someone took had to be taken for him. Every dream had to be buried beneath the reality of survival. And with each passing year, the voice of shame grew louder than the memory of honor. But here is what the world missed. The fall did not cancel the covenant. Though his feet were broken, the blood in his veins still carried the echo of Jonathan's vow. David had made a promise, sealed not in politics, but in loyalty, love, and divine witness. And while Mephibosheth may have forgotten that promise in his pain, heaven had not. Sometimes, our greatest trauma becomes the doorway to our greatest redemption. Because grace does not ignore the fall, it reaches through it. God does not discard the broken. He seeks them out. Mephibosheth's injury may have exiled him from the palace, but it could not erase his place in the promise. The king had not forgotten. So he lived in the tension between the brokenness of now and the covenant of then, between the limp of his body and the legacy of his blood, between who the world saw and who heaven still claimed. And in that space, something was stirring, something no one could see yet. Because redemption does not rush, it waits for the perfect time to knock on the door of the forgotten. Years passed. The sound of palace halls was replaced by silence. No royal garments, no lineage honored. Mephibosheth now lived in Lo-Debar, a dry, forgotten place. Its name meant no pasture, no word, no thing. A land of barrenness, a place you went to disappear. And Mephibosheth did just that. Not because he wanted to, but because the world no longer had a place for broken royalty. Lo-Debar wasn't just a location, it was a condition of the soul. When life wounds you deep enough, you stop dreaming. You stop hoping, you settle. Mephibosheth, once destined for kingly tables, now found himself surviving in obscurity. He was royalty in hiding, living with Mashiach, a generous man but not his father, not his blood, not his kingdom. He likely told himself he was forgotten, and maybe that was easier. To believe there would be no more disappointment, no more shame, no more reaching for a name that no longer opened doors. In Lo-Debar, the crippled prince faded into routine. Every sunrise looked like the last. Every shadow whispered the same lie. you're no longer worthy. But worth is not measured by movement, not in the kingdom of God. While Mephibosheth sat in silence, the covenant still spoke. Though he had accepted exile, heaven had not. The vow David made to Jonathan still echoed in eternity. A king's word, once given before God, cannot be erased by war, time, or distance. And it was about to call the forgotten into remembrance. Lo-Debar is where many of us hide after the fall, after the wound, after we think the story is over. We live below our calling because the pain taught us to expect nothing more. But there are moments in life when grace comes looking, not because we called for it, but because it was promised. And when that happens, even Lo-Debar can become holy ground. Mephibosheth had no idea that someone was asking about him. That in Jerusalem, the king had remembered a covenant. He didn't know that David had spoken the words, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He didn't know that mercy had risen like a dawn over his night. Because grace doesn't need your permission to pursue you. It only needs a covenant to stand on. And the king's promise had not expired. Mephibosheth had spent years believing he was a dead dog, but the king saw a son. A broken body did not disqualify him. A hidden life did not erase him. The royal table still had a seat with his name on it. In Lo-Debar, he learned how to survive, but he had forgotten how to belong. But God had not forgotten. Not the vow, not the bloodline, not the face of the boy once dropped. And as the royal messengers approached his hiding place, carrying the voice of the king, one truth was about to shatter his silence forever. Covenant remembers what pain tries to bury. In the stillness of his palace, King David sat with a question burning in his heart. Not about war, not about politics, but about a promise. Is there still anyone left from the house of Saul, that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? It wasn't sentiment, it was covenant speaking. Years had passed since Jonathan died, but David remembered. Covenant never forgets. That question wasn't born from pity. It came from love, loyalty forged in the wilderness, when Jonathan stood beside David while his own father sought to kill him. They made a sacred vow before God that their descendants would be protected, honored, remembered. And though Jonathan was gone, the vow still breathed. David wasn't searching for a servant, he was searching for a son of the promise. They told him there was one left, a man named Mephibosheth, lame in both feet, hidden in Lo-Debar, no army, no throne, no status, just a forgotten life in a forgotten place. But David didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about his abilities. He didn't measure his worth. He simply said, "Bring him, because covenant calls you not by your condition, but by your connection." Imagine the moment the messengers arrived, the thundering of horses breaking Lo-Debar's silence. Mephibosheth must have feared the worst. A crippled descendant of a fallen king, surely they had come to finish what history started. But grace never wears the face of revenge. It wears the robe of mercy. And this time, the king wasn't calling him to judgment, but to restoration, carried by men. Mephibosheth entered the palace he once might have ruled. Everything must have felt like a dream too distant, too painful to hope for. As he stood before David, trembling, unsure, he fell on his face and said, "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" But David's reply was swift, royal, and burning with covenant fire. "Do not be afraid." The king said, "I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." This wasn't charity. It wasn't compensation. It was covenant in motion. Mephibosheth had nothing, but the vow had everything. And in that moment, something eternal happened. The past was not erased, but redeemed. His shame didn't disappear, but it was covered by love. The man who thought himself forgotten was now honored like a prince, not because he earned it, but because he was loved by someone who did. Jonathan's faithfulness had reached across death to lift his son into destiny. This is how covenant works. It finds the broken, it lifts the fallen, it brings home the exiled. David didn't act because Mephibosheth deserved it. He acted because he promised, and that promise was stronger than time, pain, or distance. That is the heartbeat of grace, not based on performance, but on promise. In the court of the king, Mephibosheth's identity was rewritten, not by sword or politics, but by remembrance. Not because of who he was, but because of whose he was. He came crawling in fear, but he would remain forever at the table of the king. The journey from Lo-Debar to Jerusalem had been long, but what waited for Mephibosheth was even more unimaginable. David didn't just offer him mercy, he gave him a seat, not in the corner, not as a guest, but at the royal table as one of the king's own sons. A crippled man who couldn't walk was now sitting among warriors, counselors, and princes. Each meal became a miracle. As he took his place, Mephibosheth's legs were hidden beneath the royal table. What once marked his shame was now covered by grace. No one asked about his past. No one reminded him of the fall, day after day. He sat as an heir not because of strength, but because of promise. The table had the power to rewrite identity. In the presence of others, his body still bore the signs of brokenness, but around David's table, he wasn't defined by them. The table didn't fix his legs, it restored his name. That's what grace does. It may not always undo the scars, but it declares you belong anyway. Mephibosheth didn't need to walk to be royal. He only needed to be called. And David called him son. That word pierced through years of silence. It silenced every whisper that said he was unworthy. It spoke louder than the fall, louder than exile, louder than shame. The boy who had been dropped was now seated in dignity. The name Mephibosheth, once dripping with disgrace, was now spoken with honor in the king's house. Around the table, he heard stories of battle, strategy, vision, but he was part of that story now. Not an outsider. His presence wasn't tolerated, it was celebrated. The covenant had not just rescued him, it had restored him. The seat he occupied wasn't an act of pity, but a proclamation: grace gives you what you lost and more. This was no temporary favor. David ordered that Mephibosheth eat at his table always, not once, not occasionally, always. That word echoed like a promise carved in stone. The crippled prince would never go hungry again. He would never be forgotten again. Every meal would whisper, "You are still part of the kingdom." Even the land of Saul was returned to him, along with servants to work it. But it wasn't the land that changed Mephibosheth, it was the table, because land restores status, but the table restores identity. It reminded him daily, you were broken, but you are not banished. You were dropped, but you are not disqualified. This is the mystery of redemption. It doesn't just rescue, it redefines. It doesn't just heal, it repositions. God doesn't bring us to his table to remind us of our fall, but to reveal our worth. Mephibosheth entered trembling, calling himself a dead dog. But grace interrupted that script, and now he lived not by fear, but by favor. And though his feet never walked again, his heart ran free. Because when grace sets your place at the table, no one can take it away. Mephibosheth's story isn't just about an ancient prince, it's about us. Beneath the historical details lies a spiritual mirror. like him. We were born into royalty, created in the image of God. But something went wrong. Humanity fell. We were dropped not by a nurse, but by sin itself. And ever since, we've been living with the wounds of that fall. Many of us have settled in our own Lo-Debar. We've accepted barrenness as our home, shame as our name, and survival as our destiny. We believe we're forgotten. We believe we're broken beyond repair. But the story of Mephibosheth whispers a different truth, one that slices through centuries to reach your ears right now. You are not forgotten. Because long before the fall, a covenant was made, not between Jonathan and David, but between the Father and the Son, a covenant sealed in eternity, a promise that those who are crippled by sin, who think they are disqualified, would one day be brought back not by works but by grace, not by strength, but by the blood of the Lamb. Like David searched for the crippled son of his beloved friend, God sent his Son to search for us. Jesus didn't wait for us to come to him. He came to us, not to condemn, but to carry us from Lo-Debar to the royal table. And there, he doesn't just forgive, he redefines. He takes your shame and gives you sonship. He takes your limp and calls it part of your journey. The table of grace is still set, and the chairs are still marked with names, yours included. God is not repelled by your brokenness. He is moved by it. He is the King who sees the pain others overlook. He doesn't ask you to rise on your own. He sends for you, carries you, and places you where only covenant can place you. Mephibosheth never earned the table, but he was loved by someone who did. That is the gospel. We are brought in not because of our merit, but because of Christ's. The same way Mephibosheth was blessed for Jonathan's sake, we are brought in for Jesus' sake. We sit, not because we are worthy, but because he is faithful. And every time we doubt, every time we limp through life, the table still waits. It still whispers, you belong. You don't need perfect legs, you need a willing heart. Grace will do the rest. The message of Mephibosheth is simple but stunning. Grace remembers the forgotten, pursues the broken, and honors the covenant no matter how far you've fallen. He never walked the same, even after the restoration, even after the seat at the king's table. Mephibosheth still bore the limp. The pain didn't vanish, but its meaning changed. What was once a mark of shame became a symbol of grace. Every step he took reminded him not of how far he had fallen, but of how far mercy had carried him. The limp became his legacy. Not a weakness, but a witness, a testimony that even the broken can be chosen, that even the wounded can be seated. He didn't have to pretend to be whole, he only had to be present, in a world obsessed with strength. Mephibosheth's life whispered a deeper truth. You don't need to walk perfectly to be part of the promise. His story reminds us that healing doesn't always mean walking without scars. Sometimes it means being seen, known, and loved in spite of them. The limp is not the end. It's the reminder that grace was greater and that the covenant still holds. Maybe you feel forgotten. Maybe you've been dropped by life, by people, by circumstances you never chose. Maybe your feet don't move like they used to. Your faith has limped. Your identity has faded. But the King is still asking, is there anyone left? And he's not looking for the strong. He's looking for the marked, the wounded, the ones who've survived Lo-Debar. He's not calling you to earn your way back. He's calling you to come, to sit, to rest in the seat grace prepared before you even knew you were missing. You are not what was done to you. You are not your limp. You are not your shame. You are covenant blood. And there's still a place for you at the King's table. If this story awakened something in you, if you've ever felt dropped, broken, or forgotten, type in the comments, "I still belong at his table." Let the world and the darkness know you are not finished. Like this video if it spoke to your heart. Subscribe to Ancient Light for more biblical revelations, hidden truths, and divine awakenings.